The Republican leadership is divorced from reality. The facts on the ground have made clear that the beginnings of an increase in young people arriving at our southern border started prior to Joe Biden's election. But of course, they want to distract from the fact that every single Republican in the House and the Senate voted against the $1.9 trillion American Rescue Plan. The Republicans voted against sending everyday Americans $1,400 checks.
Leader McCarthy didn't talk about the American Rescue Plan when he went down and took his trip to the border. This is an effort to distract, just like the chairman said, from a very popular piece of legislation that has real impacts in our communities. And they're conflating these issues, which is no surprise with children fleeing Northern Triangle countries. And if the Republicans want to work with us on those issues, we're happy to do it. But they didn't offer solutions. They're not offering solutions. They want to distract from the American Rescue Plan.
As it relates to the situation that exists on our southern border, I look forward to hearing from the Homeland Security Secretary. I don't want to characterize it one way or the other, but I do believe that the Republican rhetoric is irresponsible and it's designed to try to politicize an issue that we should tackle together as Americans.
DHS Secretary said yesterday that they're on a record hasn't seen in 20 years of immigration coming to the border. So that's not it. So you don't think it's reached a crisis level yet if this amount of numbers keeps going up?
We have to deal with the issue decisively, but I'm not quite sure of why linguistic characterization one way or the other gets us to solving the problem. We just have to solve the problem.
President Trump refused to acknowledge that, instead used these terms, China virus, Wuhan virus, and even Kung flu. And as a result, the anti-Asian hate crimes and incidents increased exponentially. In fact, this company researched the amount of anti-Asian Twitter traffic in those first few months of his usage of these terms, and it increased by 900%.
Prayers, our deepest sympathies to the families of the victims of the tragic and violent massacre down in the Atlanta metro area. Our hearts are broken at this senseless act of violence, and we want to make sure that any and all perpetrators are prosecuted, convicted, and locked up to the full extent of the law. We'll hear from Representative Judy Chu, who has been leading the effort as it relates to the startling rise of anti-Asian violence in America. But we stand in full and complete solidarity with our Asian American brothers and sisters throughout the country, and we will not rest until we stop Asian hate in America. We had a very good conversation earlier today as part of our weekly House Democratic Caucus meeting. We heard from the lead sponsors of 4 critical pieces of legislation that will be on the floor of the House of Representatives this week: the reauthorization of the Violence Against Women's Act, the Dream and Promise Act, the Farm Workers Bill led by Chairwoman Zoe Lofgren, and the extension of the date with respect to ratification of the Equal Rights Amendment to ensure that we address the fact that the United States of America is the only country in the free world with a written constitution that does not explicitly prohibit discrimination against women. It's time for us to deal with that glaring omission. Our members were spread across the country over the last few days, back home in our districts, and the acclaim and the support for the American Rescue Plan is wide and it's deep. And we're thankful for the leadership of President Biden, Vice President Harris, Speaker Pelosi, Leader Schumer, and Democrats on both sides of the Capitol for meeting the moment and responding in a transformational way with respect to the $1.9 trillion American Rescue Plan, because the needs are so extensive. The pain and the suffering and the death experienced by the American people are startling And that is why it was necessary to respond. And now we're working as hard as we can to make sure that all of the benefits and relief that is contained within the American Rescue Plan make it to the everyday Americans who are in so desperate need for the support. Let me now yield to the distinguished Vice Chair of the House Democratic Caucus, Representative Aguilar.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As you all know, last week, President Biden signed the American Rescue Plan into law. This is a transformative piece of legislation that impacts communities like mine and our communities around the country. The last few weeks, I've been joining virtual city council meetings in my district to share the funding levels for our communities. And when I talk to local mayors and school board members, city council members, they don't bring up the partisan attacks that we see here under the dome, or the language or the talking points that we see from Republican leaders. Instead, they talk about what this means to their communities, for our first responders, for our essential workers, for the extension of library hours, for our students and teachers. This is an example that President Biden and congressional Democrats doing right by the American people and acting on those priorities, and an example of Republican congressional leadership failing to understand those priorities back home. And that's what we'll continue to do this week by passing the Violence Against Women Act, the Equal Rights Amendment, the Farm Worker Modernization Act, and the Dream and Promise Act. This legislation to address problems and inequities in our communities. These are things that the American people want to see fixed. And just like the chairman, I'd just like to offer my thoughts and my prayers for those affected by the tragedy down in Atlanta. The chairman mentioned someone who we turn to for advice on so many issues is joining us here today to talk about this tragedy, Congresswoman Judy Chu.
Yesterday in Atlanta, 8 people were killed as a result of 3 shootings at Asian spas that occurred within a few hours. 6 of the 8 victims were Asian American women. It appears the shooter, age 21, a white male, first went to a spa called Young's Asian Massage. The fact that he went to that one with that title gives you a clue as to what he was thinking. This is one of the more violent tragedies in a string of about 3,800 hate incidents and crimes against Asian Americans, 68% of them women. It's clear that the individuals were targeted because they are amongst the most vulnerable in our country, immigrant Asian women. The AAPI community has been living in fear of verbal and physical attacks, and now we're experiencing increasingly deadly tragedies of racism and violence. We call on Georgia officials to ensure that the families of the victims are well supported, and our followers to support local efforts that provide community protection and victim support. And we express our deepest condolences to the friends and families of these victims. The AAPI community tells us that they have been living in a steady state of tension this entire pandemic. Yesterday's crimes are beyond terrifying, but it just brings home to so many Asian Americans that they are fearful of their lives and circumstances where they would otherwise feel safe in their homes and at their jobs. And not only that, they are risking infection when going to work at places like a spa or a nail salon, and now they're risking increased targeted violence. The Congressional Asian Pacific American Caucus, which I chair, calls for solidarity against hate, and these are the actions we are taking. Because of President Biden, we have met with the Department of Justice, and we are right now determining actions against AAPI hate. We have called for a hearing in the Judiciary Committee against and about these crimes, these anti-Asian hate crimes. And that hearing will take place tomorrow morning. We are calling for the passage of the No Hate Act, which would finally bring resources to local law enforcement so that they can improve their hate crime programs. Finally, we're calling for a national day to speak out against AAPI hate, and that is March 26. We know that if we stand together, we can defeat this hate, and it is only if we support one another that this can end.
Thank you, Chairwoman Chu, for your extraordinary leadership on this critically important issue, and we continue to stand with you and will until we crush this hatred directed at the AAPI community. Questions?
Amid this border surge, you're going to bring these immigration bills to the floor. You've heard the complaints, the criticisms from across the aisle that leniency in immigration policy is the cause of this, and the difference between the Trump administration and the Biden administration is just that, and it is encouraging more and more people to come to the border. Are you worried about the optics, especially for your moderate members, of having to vote on immigration, despite it being popular? We realize the popularity of the DREAM Act outside of the Beltway. But Republicans are going to use this. They're going to make political hay out of it. And are your moderates concerned about that?
No, I believe that the Dream and Promise Act, as well as the Farm Workers Bill, will receive significant support amongst Democrats and be bipartisan in nature. In fact, all of the bills that we are bringing to the floor this week, the four that have been mentioned, the two immigration bills, as well as the Violence Against Women's Act and the ERA extension, I think will receive Republican votes. The Republican leadership is divorced from reality. The facts on the ground have made clear that the beginnings of an increase in young people arriving at our southern border started prior to Joe Biden's election. But of course, they want to distract from the fact that every single Republican in the House and the Senate voted against the $1.9 trillion American Rescue Plan. The Republicans voted against sending everyday Americans $1,400 checks. The Republicans voted against extending unemployment insurance. The Republicans voted against the enhanced child tax credit. The Republicans voted against relief for those who are suffering from hunger and food insecurity, and they voted against sending relief to our first responders. And so they are struggling to find a counter narrative. With respect to the Dream and Promise Act, as you pointed out, it is incredibly popular with Democrats, independents, and has strong Republican support across the country. Our standard for bipartisanship can no longer be what happens here in the Capitol, because we know that the strategy of legislatively is not to try and find common ground. It's obstruction and mischaracterization. They ran this playbook during the Obama administration in the early years, and throughout his presidency, they are running the same playbook again. We will not let them get away with it.
Leader McCarthy didn't talk about the American Rescue Plan when he went down and took his trip to the border. This is an effort to distract, just like the chairman said, from a very popular piece of legislation that has real impacts in our communities. And they're conflating these issues, which is no surprise. The Dream and Promise Act and the Farm Worker Modernization Act have strong support back home in our communities, but even here in Congress. And so we will continue to work in a bipartisan way to find solutions. Secretary Mayorkas put out material yesterday. He's testifying to Homeland Security, to Homeland Security Committee. And so we will continue to work with the administration to address these issues. But let's not conflate young people who are here as dreamers and their path to citizenship within these bills, people who know of no other country but the United States as their home, with children fleeing Northern Triangle countries. And if the Republicans want to work with us on those issues, we're happy to do it. But they didn't offer solutions. They're not offering solutions. They want to distract from the American Rescue Plan and the popularity of that as we move forward. And we're going to continue to highlight what are important issues in our communities. And these are those issues.
Mr. Jeffrey, so we saw last night there's some news about vaccines coming to staff. There's also a report that 75% of members have been vaccinated here. of course, things look like they're starting to get a little bit more back to normal. I'm curious when you think the House might start to transition away from 45-minute votes on the floor, transition away from some of the requirements that have put in place. How are you guys managing, bringing about a little bit sense of normalcy while protecting the safety of those who aren't vaccinated yet?
I have great confidence in Speaker Pelosi and Leader Hoyer to make that decision in the same way that they've made decisions throughout the duration of the pandemic, which is anchored in the public health guidance. And as soon as we are in a position to be able to return to a greater degree of normalcy here at the Capitol in the midst of this deadly pandemic that has killed more than 500,000 Americans and caused so much pain and suffering across the country, I think that decision will be made. I don't have any time frame with respect to it, but I know that they will continue to follow the public health guidance as well as the science.
3 quick questions. One, where are you on pay-fors for infrastructure? Are you looking at the corporate tax, capital gains tax, anything else?
Well, those are conversations that I believe have just begun. You may have seen a few days ago, Speaker Pelosi asked all of the relevant committee chairs, led by Chairman DeFazio, but also including Chairman Frank Pallone, Chairman Bobby Scott, Chairwoman Maxine Waters, and others who are going to be involved in the infrastructure bill that will be important to the American people, to begin bipartisan discussions with their Republican counterparts to see where the common ground can be found. And so I think that is the moment that we're in. That's the foundation. We'll see whether those bipartisan conversations bear any fruit. And until those conversations take place, I don't want to get out ahead of what the possible pay-fors could be in an infrastructure bill.
And then secondly, I know that you have not called on Governor Cuomo to resign, but in light of the president's comments last night in an interview saying that he should resign if the investigation proves the sexual assault allegations to be true, does that change your position in any way? And have you spoken to the governor recently?
I don't think his position is any different than the position that many of us have articulated. And I think the reality is we've got an impeachment investigation that is in front of us, as well as a very thorough Attorney General investigation that is in front of us that has already begun. I believe 2 of the women who have come forward have already been interviewed extensively. They're providing documents. We want to make sure they continue to be treated with dignity and respect, that the investigations proceed in a thorough, comprehensive, and expeditious fashion. And then when the results of those investigations are presented to the public, I think some important decisions on accountability are going to have to be made.
Spoken to the governor?
I don't want to comment on who I've spoken to and who I have not spoken to. I spent a lot of time, however, speaking to my constituents about a variety of issues over the last few days when I was back at home.
I was wondering, I had 2 questions as well. One was for you, sir, on do you think that what's going on at the border right now is a crisis? And then I had a separate question for Congresswoman 2 on what she thought President Trump's rhetoric has that led to what happened yesterday and how his rhetoric might have been causing this increase in hate crimes against Asian Americans?
Well, let me simply say that there's a humanitarian crisis that has taken place in the Central American Northern Triangle countries of Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador. And we have to deal with the root causes of the migration if we are going to decisively deal with the challenges that exist at the border. There's a crisis of corruption in those countries, a crisis of violence, a crisis of persecution, and a great many challenges that exist. President Biden has introduced comprehensive immigration reform that includes trying to decisively address the issues in the Central American Northern Triangle countries, and I think that it's an important pathway forward. As it relates to the situation that exists on our southern border, I look forward to hearing from the Homeland Security Secretary. I don't want to characterize it one way or the other, but I do believe that the Republican rhetoric is irresponsible and it's designed to try to politicize an issue that we should tackle together as Americans.
DHS Secretary said yesterday that Your Honor, a record hadn't seen in 20 years of immigration coming to the border. So that's not it. So you don't think it's reached a crisis level yet if this amount of numbers keeps going up?
We have to deal with the issue decisively, but I'm not quite sure of why linguistic characterization one way or the other gets us to solving the problem. We just have to solve the problem and do it in a comprehensive way.
President Trump clearly stoked the flames of xenophobia against AAPIs with his rhetoric. The CDC and the World Health Organization said that we should all use the official term COVID-19 in order to make sure that this disease is not associated with a particular geographical location or ethnicity due to the stigma it causes. And President Trump refused to acknowledge that, instead used these terms, China virus, Wuhan virus, and even Kung flu. And as a result, the anti-Asian hate crimes and incidents increased exponentially. In fact, this company researched the amount of anti-Asian Twitter traffic in those first few months of his usage of these terms, and it increased by 900%. So we took him on every single time he used this rhetoric with press statements, letters, everything you can imagine, but instead he doubled down. He and his followers actually used those terms even more, and what we saw yesterday is the result of that.
And I would encourage members of Congress who continue to use that type of hateful rhetoric, cut it out, because you also have blood on your hands.
Wait, to follow up, both of these questions. To follow up on the Governor Cuomo, 16 of the 19 New York members of the New York congressional delegation, Democrats, called for his resignation. Why won't you join those 16?
I issued a statement on Friday, and my statement speaks for itself.
Okay, then to follow up on Sarah's question, when there's a return to normal in the House, is there caucus behind a eliminating of proxy voting?
Well, there hasn't been a conversation with respect to the proxy voting issue. That was implemented consistent with the guidance from our public health professionals and to provide for an opportunity for those members who are unable to travel to Washington, D.C. because of the pandemic to continue to be able to voice their representation on behalf of the people that they're privileged to represent. As the public health
to proxy voting, should that be the recommendation?
Well, we haven't had that conversation, so I don't want to get out ahead of any recommendation that may or may not come forward. I mean, I think that there will be people who have perspectives on both sides of the issue, and we'll have a family conversation, and we'll see what the highest common denominator is at the end of the day.
So it would be a fundamental shift in how the House votes. I mean, this was done out of an extreme need for a unique circumstance, and if the circumstances shifted, would not the need shift?
I appreciate the questions, but I'm not going to address a hypothetical possibility that isn't in front of us yet in terms of what the discussion shows and reveals amongst House Democrats and what the public health guidance may be.
Chairman, on taxes, do you support a corporate tax increase, capital gains tax increase, and a high income tax increase?
Well, I think that we have to make sure that the wealthy, the well-off, and the well-connected in this country pay their fair share. It should be done in the context of holistically looking at the failings of the GOP tax scam, where 83% of the benefits went to the wealthiest 1% in America at a time where the economy, the Obama economy, was thriving, and there was absolutely no need to saddle our children and grandchildren with $2 trillion worth of debt. But I don't want to comment specifically on any particular component of how you make sure that everyone in this country, particularly the wealthiest amongst us, pay their fair share and get out ahead of the Ways and Means Committee.
There's been continuing delays on the suspension bill calendar, which is one of the few sort of bipartisan processes in the House. Yesterday, Leader McCarthy said that he did not see that as a problem. Are there any discussions among Democrats right now to find a way to sort of get back to passing bills on suspension via voice votes and also not having to waste time with motions to adjourn that are doomed to fail?
Well, it's my understanding that Steny Hoyer continues to talk to Leader McCarthy as it relates to how to move forward with respect to the suspension calendar in particular. And I don't anticipate that the House will take any steps until those conversations conclude, hopefully in a positive way, because the suspension calendar enables both Democrats and Republicans to bring bills to the floor of the House of Representatives that have bipartisan support and we deem to be important to the American people we represent. Last question.
On the January 6th commission, saw Speaker Pelosi's letter on Monday, I guess it was, but there doesn't seem to have been any movement, particularly from the Republican side. Still this fight over the membership of the committee, subpoena power, and some other things. Is there a scenario here where Democrats will conduct this by themselves if Republicans refuse to participate?
Well, it's my hope that it's not a scenario that comes to fruition because, the January 6th violent attack on the Capitol wasn't really a partisan issue. An attack on our democracy impacts not just Democrats or Republicans or independents. It impacts all of us. And I think the objective remains to try to do this in a bipartisan way. Pete, Judy? All right. Thank you, everyone.